The HOA president marched contractors onto land my parents purchased decades before her tiny realm even existed. She beamed as if the place belonged to her, handed out shiny brochures, and assured neighbors a sparkling future built on my acreage, as though I had already disappeared. I lay awake at night listening to engines rumble across my ground, counting every headlight that slid past my window, wondering how much they'd seize before I finally lost it. Call me insane, but tell me in the comments, would you have trusted the system or stood up to them? Standing on my parents' old plot, I clutched the yellow deed dated 1978. The ink had faded, but the legal wording was unmistakable. Mom and Dad bought this 3-acre parcel and put up their humble ranch house 17 years before the Willowbrook Homeowners Association existed. Back then, the area was farmland with a few scattered homes. The HOA didn't appear until 1995 when developers began squeezing in cookie-cutter houses. Property corners were still marked with rusted metal stakes if you knew where to look. I'd inherited mineral and water rights in every inch of dirt. Crucially, I'd inherited it free of any HOA restrictions. Here's what a lot of people miss about homeowner associations. They only govern properties that have voluntarily signed the CC&Rs, covenants, conditions, and restrictions for those keeping score. My land predated their little empire by nearly 20 years. I was checking the survey markers when voices approached. Susan Peterson came out from the tree line with a surveying crew and someone wearing a county jacket. She walked with the swagger of someone who assumed her title extended beyond her subdivision. The surveyor was already setting up equipment on my property without permission. The county guy looked uneasy, probably realizing he'd been given incomplete facts about the visit. Susan spotted me and marched over with that practiced meeting smile. "Mr. Grant, perfect timing. We're going to optimize this underutilized space to build a community wellness center. The neighborhood really needs a gathering place, don't you think?" Her tone implied it was a done deal, not a proposal. I noticed she didn't say who had authorized turning my private land into this optimized asset. I kept my tone calm and curious. "Interesting project, Susan. Do you have the building permits for construction on private property?" The surveyor paused and the county official shifted his weight. Susan waved me off like I'd asked about the weather. "HOA projects don't need individual permits. We manage community development through our board authority." That was flatly incorrect, and we both knew it. Before I could answer, Frank Miller's voice cut through the morning. My neighbor had been watching from his yard. "That's completely incorrect," he called, coming over. Frank had retired from the county building department after 30 years. His voice carried the weight of someone who'd actually issued permits. "Every construction project needs permits, especially on private land." "Ma'am, do you have authorization from the property owner?" Susan's smile tightened. She clearly hadn't expected an expert to show up so early in her scheme. "I don't need authorization. I'm the HOA president, and this property falls under our community development guidelines." The surveyor and the county official exchanged looks. Even they could tell something was off. Frank folded his arms and studied Susan like she was an application missing signatures. Mrs. Chen from down the street, who'd been walking her dog, stopped to watch. She sidled up to me and murmured, "She tried the same thing with the Johnsons last year. They had to hire a lawyer to stop her from improving their backyard without permission. Cost them thousands just to make her go away." That explained Susan's boldness. She'd been testing limits and getting away with it. While Susan spelled out her imaginary authority to Frank, I realized something important. 5 years ago, when a property dispute cost me my previous house, I would have panicked. I would have yelled or made angry calls to lawyers I couldn't afford. I'd learned the hard lesson that emotional reactions usually make matters worse. This time would be different. This time I had facts, patience, and a plan. I took out my phone and opened the camera app while Susan continued her pitch to Frank about community development powers. Every word she spoke mattered. Every false claim was evidence. She was, in effect, confessing to planned wrongdoing while I recorded it. Sometimes the smartest move is to let your opponent dig their own hole while you hold the shovel. Frank was explaining basic property law when I interrupted politely. "Susan, I appreciate your enthusiasm for community improvement. Can you show me the statute that grants HOA presidents authority over non-member private property?" She blinked several times, clearly not expecting a legal challenge. The surveyor began packing up, a smart man who recognized liability when he saw it. Susan adopted the condescending tone she used for new residents. Mr. Grant, I know property law can be confusing for lay people, but as HOA president, I have broad discretionary powers for community betterment. Your parents' old lot has been vacant too long and needs development. She gestured toward my land as if it were abandoned instead of my inherited property. I held up the deed for everyone to see. This land was inherited, Susan. It predates your HOA by 17 years. You have about as much authority over my property as the mayor of Dallas has over a farm in Oklahoma. The county official suddenly became deeply absorbed in his clipboard. Frank nodded. Mrs. Chen whispered, "I knew it," to her small dog. Susan's face shifted from confidence to calculation. I could practically see her trying to figure out how to salvage her plan without admitting she was wrong. "Well, we'll see about that," she said at last. "I'll consult our HOA attorney about abandoned property statutes and community safety issues." She turned and walked away, leaving her crew to pack up and follow, watching her retreat toward the subdivision. I realized something that should have scared me, but didn't. She actually believed she had legal power she didn't possess. That dangerous blend of confidence and ignorance was bound to make her attempt something spectacularly foolish. I'd be ready with my camera when she did. The next morning I was surprised to see Peterson's car at the county building department. Most people would have started construction after being challenged. The HOA president, however, appeared to be trying to legitimize her plan through official channels. I parked across the street and watched through the glass as she argued with a clerk. Her body language betrayed frustration and mounting desperation as conversations grew more heated. Frank had mentioned he needed to renew his contractor's license that day, so I texted him where she was. He arrived 20 minutes later, and we watched her increasingly tense discussions with higher-level county staff. Whatever she requested, it wasn't going well. After an hour, she stormed out empty-handed, face flushed with irritation and the kind of anger that comes when people who actually understand the law challenge your authority. Frank went inside to handle his renewal while I waited in the lot. When he returned, he had confirmation of what I'd suspected about Peterson's desperation. "I asked my buddy Tom what she wanted," Frank said with a smirk. "She tried to get permits for construction on land she doesn't own." When Tom explained deeds must be held by applicants for permits, Susan argued HOA presidents have community development authority. He'd shaken his head at the absurdity. Tom told her, "No HOA in Texas has authority over non-member private estates." That afternoon, a pickup pulled into my driveway, and a middle-aged man in work clothes approached, looking worried. "Excuse me, sir. Are you the landowner here?" I nodded. He glanced around before continuing. "I'm the contractor Mrs. Peterson hired for this project. I need to ask you something important. It's been bothering me since I reviewed the blueprints." He produced rolled plans and spread them on his truck hood with shaking hands. "Mrs. Peterson told me we're building a community wellness center, but these plans show a private residence. Master bedroom, gourmet kitchen, 3-car garage, wine cellar. I've built dozens of community centers. None had walk-in closets or luxury bathrooms like these." His worry was real. The liability dawned on him as he spoke. "She keeps talking about community development and HOA authority, but I'm starting to think we're part of something illegal. I don't want my company tied to unauthorized construction or fraud." Smart contractor. He'd seen what Peterson either missed or deliberately obscured, showed him my deed and inheritance paperwork, and watched his face go pale as he grasped the scale of Peterson's deception. "Jesus Christ," he said. "She told me the HOA owned this land and had full development rights. She even showed me fake permits and authorization letters." He rolled the blueprints back up with disgust and rising fear. "I'm calling my insurance company and my lawyer right now. This could ruin my business and my family's livelihood." Rather than back down after losing her contractor, Peterson moved to financial tactics. That afternoon, my phone never stopped ringing. Calls from my homeowner's insurance, mortgage lender, and the county tax office, all asking about pending construction and liability reports tied to my estate. The onslaught was suffocating. Each ring tightened my chest and dragged up memories of losing my previous house 5 years earlier. Laura watched as I took call after call, her face growing more anxious with every conversation. The insurance agent sounded baffled by the contradictory reports they'd been given, and the mortgage officer spoke with real worry about unauthorized changes that might affect our loan terms. By nightfall, the strain was showing, and I found myself being pulled back into the same trauma of legal fights and financial manipulation that had cost me everything before. After the seventh call, Laura pulled me aside, her voice tight. "Jonathan, she's not only attacking our land anymore. She's trying to systematically wreck our finances and credit. This is exactly like what happened 5 years ago." "I'm terrified we're not ready for this coordinated assault." Her fear reminded me why I'd been so meticulous about documenting everything this time, that evening. Peterson came to my front door with her husband, a manila folder, and a look that suggested she thought she'd found a knockout argument. Her husband looked ill at ease, like he'd been roped into something he didn't fully approve of and was beginning to grasp the legal stakes. She thrust the folder at me without small talk, speaking with the certainty of someone convinced she held all the leverage. "Mr. Grant, I've discovered significant financial irregularities that require immediate HOA intervention for community protection and safety," inside were documents, alleging my taxes were delinquent and that liens had been filed for community maintenance. Assessments totaling $12,000. The paperwork looked official at first glance, but anyone familiar with tax documents would spot obvious mistakes. Peterson had clearly spent time manufacturing fake financial records to support her claims, but the formatting was off. The assessment figures didn't line up with county records, and the charges exceeded any legitimate HOA authority. Mrs. Chen, walking her dog, paused nearby and grew skeptical as Peterson tried to explain complicated retroactive billing for services I never requested or received. Frank came over, took one look at the papers, and, with the eye of someone who'd reviewed thousands of legitimate financial documents, immediately called them out as forgeries. "Ma'am, these tax records are completely fake," he said. "The formatting's wrong, the assessment numbers don't match county systems, and HOA liens can't exceed actual services provided." Laura came outside to see what was happening and, with her legal training, asked the precise, uncomfortable questions that made Peterson squirm. As Peterson and her husband left, I realized she'd made a grave error, handing me physical evidence of document forgery and financial fraud. Her lies were growing too tangled, and every desperate move was generating more proof for potential prosecution. Frank stayed to explain the criminal implications. Combined with the contractor's earlier statements, these forged papers meant I had professional witnesses who could attest to her fraudulent claims. Didn't know whether documenting Peterson's wrongdoing would clear my name or if she'd successfully frame me as the antagonist. 2 weeks after the contractor backed out, Peterson hired a replacement who seemed less scrupulous and more motivated by high emergency rates. I woke at 6 a.m. to the rumble of heavy machinery crossing my property line, the ground trembling as bulldozers ripped through decades of vegetation. From my bedroom window, I watched the destruction while the HOA president stood nearby with a hard hat, directing crews like she owned the land. She decided to begin work regardless of permits or title, betting that possession would retroactively justify her actions. I called Frank. He came over with his camera and tape measure. We stood together at the line, documenting active trespass and the destruction of private property. "Every hour they work, damages and criminal liability pile up," he said, methodically photographing the equipment and workers tearing up my parents' garden. "She thinks speed will bury the law, but she's actually creating evidence against herself." The crew's efficiency suggested Peterson had paid for haste over legality, and by midday they'd cleared a large swath and started excavating a foundation that clearly matched a luxury home, not any community center. Neighbors gathered throughout the day, drawn by the dramatic change to land that had been quiet for decades. Some wanted to know scope and timeline. Others worried about noise, disruption, and the obvious legal issues of unauthorized construction. Peterson used the crowd to spread her community center story, handing out polished flyers and describing wellness facilities and recreational perks that would follow. She moved through the onlookers like a politician at a rally, shaking hands and promising higher property values. The scene changed when Councilman Rick Torres arrived unexpectedly, his presence lending an air of official approval that shifted the crowd's mood. Peterson had clearly arranged for him to see the momentum she'd created, counting on his political backing to sway residents worried about values and services. Torres was up for re-election in 6 months and needed HOA endorsements across the district. Peterson had promised him unified support from several associations if he supported her projects. His appearance was a calculated political investment, not a spontaneous show of civic concern. With Torres there, Peterson addressed the neighbors with newfound credibility. This wellness center exemplifies the forward-thinking development that elevates premier communities, she said, gesturing toward the excavation. Property values will rise, recreation options will expand, and Willowbrook will set the standard for sustainable community planning. The crowd murmured as construction noises provided a dramatic backdrop. Torres echoed her rhetoric, framing the project as economic development and community enhancement. Mrs. Peterson demonstrates the innovative leadership we need, he said. Progress sometimes requires tough decisions and overcoming resistance from those who prefer the status quo. He carefully avoided any mention of property rights or legal authorization. His presence implied municipal approval, even though he privately knew the situation was dubious. Neighbors began to shift toward Peterson's side, imagining the benefits she promised. I raised my voice to address them, aware this might be my best chance to counter the political narrative before it hardened. Councilman Torres, who owns the land where this construction is taking place. My question created an awkward pause as residents waited for an authoritative reply. Torres deflected with practiced political non-answers about complex projects involving many stakeholders and legal frameworks that required professional expertise. Frank stepped up, leveraging his building department credentials to back my position. The work was happening without permits on private property. Building code violations were accumulating daily, and the structure would need total remediation before any occupancy permit. But to many neighbors, Torres's political promises and Peterson's vision carried more sway than Frank's technical warnings. Peterson attacked Frank's credibility, painting his concerns as obstructionism that blocked neighborhood progress. The crowd broke up as noise from the site made talking difficult, and many residents, uncomfortable with conflict, drifted away. Some privately supported me, whispering about liability and property rights violations, while others were genuinely impressed by Peterson's plans and political connections. The community split along lines of property rights versus development enthusiasm, making resolution more fraught and emotionally charged. That night, Laura and I stood in our yard watching equipment parked on our land like an occupying force, floodlights illuminating the excavation where concrete was being poured through the night. "She's committed now," Laura said, voice tight. Every passing day increased her financial stake and legal exposure, but it also made her more desperate to justify the project by any means, which could make her even more dangerous. Peterson had crossed a point of no return, and I wondered whether my slow, document-driven approach would be enough against someone willing to flout the law. After dinner, Frank knocked on our door with unsettling news from municipal contacts that explained Torres's involvement. Torres was facing re-election and needed HOA endorsements. Peterson had promised support from multiple neighborhood associations if he backed her initiatives. The political calculus went beyond community improvement. It involved vote trading and favors that explained Torres's willingness to overlook clear legal problems. The corruption extended beyond Peterson to include elected officials who prioritized political convenience over legal compliance and individual rights. Everything was set to come to a head the next day, and I still didn't know whether I was the neighborhood's defender or its obstacle. The morning after construction began, the campaign against me escalated into economic warfare meant to crush my finances and force compliance. My phone rang at 7 a.m. with the first call from my homeowner's insurance about liability for ongoing construction on my estate. Within an hour, my kitchen table had become command central for what felt like an orchestrated assault. Calls from mortgage companies, tax assessors, utility providers, and code enforcement officers, each reporting anonymous concerns about unauthorized development and safety violations. The barrage felt deliberate and overwhelming. Every ring tightened my chest and dragged up the nightmare of losing my home 5 years earlier. By noon, 3 inspectors had come to my door, unannounced, with clipboards full of reports alleging everything from septic failures to electrical hazards needing immediate remediation. The county building inspector, frustrated and clearly annoyed at being used for personal vendettas, told me, "Someone has been filing systematic false reports to trigger costly inspections and possible condemnation proceedings. This appears to be harassment designed to saddle you with administrative costs and compliance burdens. That's abuse of process, and we take it seriously when our department is weaponized for private disputes." The stress mounted, and I kept reliving the trauma of past legal fights and manipulations when I'd trusted the wrong people and didn't know my rights. Every unexpected knock, every official vehicle in my driveway, every clipboard-bearing inspector thrust me back into those painful memories. Laura walked in and found me at the kitchen table that afternoon, staring at a stack of inspection reports and violation notices, all of which had already been dismissed as baseless. She placed a hand on my shoulder and spoke softly. "You're not who you were 5 years ago. This time you understand the game and you have a strategy. Don't let her psychological tricks make you lose sight of that." Peterson's pressure campaign soon escalated into financial warfare. She began submitting fabricated complaints to federal agencies, accusing me of hiding rental income and committing tax fraud. The allegations implied I was running an illegal business or secretly subletting, designed to draw IRS scrutiny. If any of it had been true, the consequences could have been disastrous. Instead, I was forced to spend significant money on professional help and countless hours gathering documentation to disprove every false claim. Each fabricated filing was technically a separate crime with its own penalties, but the immediate effect was exactly what she wanted: relentless financial stress, administrative chaos, and the lingering dread that a single misstep could make her lies appear legitimate to authorities. Laura quickly reached out to our attorney to discuss pursuing harassment charges and civil action against this organized false reporting campaign meant to drain our energy and resources. During the consultation, she explained, Peterson has filed dozens of bogus complaints with multiple agencies. Each one is both a crime and a deliberate act of harassment. The timing and coordination show this isn't random. It's a strategy to break us financially and administratively. Instead of through lawful channels, the attorney confirmed her conduct amounted to criminal harassment and abusive process, but warned that proving intent and coordination would require carefully cataloging every single false filing and its sequence. Late that afternoon, the fire department showed up, responding to reports of propane storage violations and supposed electrical fire hazards that allegedly posed an urgent community threat. After completing their inspection and finding absolutely nothing wrong, the fire marshal grew suspicious about the repeated bogus emergencies tying up his team. "Ma'am has been making calls to several lenders with fabricated claims about your estate," he said grimly once the inspection was finished. "Filing false safety complaints is a serious offense with both civil and criminal consequences. We're recording this incident and will investigate where these fraudulent reports are coming from." His frustration was genuine, and in that moment I realized Peterson was starting to create enemies among the very officials she thought she could manipulate. By evening, the scope of her economic assault became clearer. Credit report inquiries, disputed mortgage payments, and fraudulent filings showed a coordinated attempt to damage our credit and financial reputation. Someone was questioning our ownership, flagging us as unstable or fraudulent, and bombarding financial institutions with false claims of loan violations and unauthorized construction. The level of planning required suggested Peterson had prepared this economic sabotage well in advance, timing it alongside her trespass and construction efforts. My mortgage company rushed an emergency inspection. Their investigator found no unauthorized construction or violations, but was puzzled at the flood of false reports. "Someone has been calling multiple institutions with fabricated allegations about your property," he explained. "This looks like a coordinated harassment effort to wreck your financial credibility and bury you in administrative problems until you're forced into some kind of settlement. That's financial fraud. We'll be reporting it to the authorities." Evidence of Peterson's systematic false reporting was piling up faster than her construction progress. Instead of panicking, I decided to use her own strategy against her. Each fraudulent complaint became another piece of evidence for criminal charges and civil damages. "Let her keep going," I told Laura as we stacked the growing pile of dismissed notices and inspector statements. "Every false claim only strengthens our case. She thinks she's overwhelming us, but she's actually building her own downfall one lie at a time." Sometimes, the strongest defense is patience combined with meticulous record-keeping. That evening, Peterson showed up at my door holding official-looking papers, her smug expression revealing she thought she had finally won. She handed me a restraining order, claiming Laura and I were a danger to community safety and HOA operations. Certain that this legal maneuver would break us, she turned and left. I closed the door calmly, stood in the hallway, and felt a slow smile spread across my face. Every fabricated filing was one more nail in her coffin. Chapter 5. the counterattack. Rather than wait for her next escalation, I chose to strike back, joining forces with Frank and relying on Laura's legal expertise. On the third day of construction, Frank and I spread the HOA bylaws across his garage workbench to map out an evidence strategy. Any expenditure over $500 requires both board approval and notice to members, Frank pointed out. If she's using HOA funds, she's in violation of nonprofit law and possibly committing embezzlement. We formally requested the association's full financial records under Texas nonprofit disclosure rules. The documents confirmed my suspicions and delivered the proof we needed. Peterson had funneled $47,000 of community money into her so-called wellness center, covering architectural plans, deposits, legal fees, and equipment rentals, all without authorization. Laura studied the records and quickly flagged multiple governance violations. "This isn't just poor leadership," she said firmly. "This is outright embezzlement, community funds stolen for personal benefit under the disguise of a neighborhood project. Every unauthorized expenditure is a separate crime." Armed with undeniable proof, I began quietly rallying neighbors, showing them the evidence one by one. Mrs. Chen was the first. Outraged, she exclaimed, "We pay $600 a year for street upkeep and community maintenance, not to bankroll private mansions. If she's stealing our money, every homeowner deserves to know now." Her anger spread quickly, and within days she had mobilized others who were equally furious. I prepared an evidence package for the media, knowing public exposure would hit harder than a private lawsuit. Within hours of my call, Channel 7's investigative reporter Sarah Martinez arrived with her crew, interviewing neighbors and filming Peterson's construction site. "Abuse of HOA authority affects thousands across Texas," she explained on camera. "This case highlights larger issues of governance and protection of homeowners' rights." The coverage was immediate and widespread. City officials who had previously remained neutral suddenly scrambled to distance themselves. Councilman Torres, once a vocal supporter of Peterson, became conspicuously silent when asked to comment. With cameras documenting clear misappropriation of funds, Peterson's political backing evaporated. The evening broadcast featured interviews with shocked residents who had just learned their dues were misused. I organized independent community meetings in Frank's garage, where Laura educated homeowners on HOA law and nonprofit rules. "Most people don't know where legitimate authority ends and abuse begins," she explained to the packed group. "Peterson has violated her fiduciary duty, stolen funds, and committed crimes while pretending to act in your interest. Facts, not emotion, were fueling opposition." The district attorney's office soon launched a full investigation into embezzlement and fraud, with prosecutor David Kim taking the lead. "This looks like systematic theft of nonprofit funds for personal enrichment," he told me. "We're treating this as a serious white-collar case, potentially with federal consequences." That validation proved my approach was working. Even Peterson's attorney withdrew after reviewing the evidence, unwilling to defend a client so clearly guilty in a case that had become high-profile through media attention. "Her liability extends well beyond property disputes into criminal embezzlement," he admitted when I reached out later. "We cannot ethically represent someone involved in obvious criminal activity." Peterson was left scrambling for new representation. Meanwhile, building inspectors began daily visits to her construction site after I supplied them with detailed evidence of permit violations and unauthorized work. Each inspection uncovered costly code violations that would delay any chance of occupancy permits. I wasn't just waiting for enforcement, I was actively feeding investigators with the documentation they needed. The inspectors welcomed the cooperation, appreciating that I understood the building codes well enough to provide useful, credible reports. Federal investigators reached out to me after I reported Peterson's use of forged property records to obtain construction loans from major banks. By submitting fake ownership documents and counterfeit permits to financial institutions that operate across state lines, she had crossed into federal jurisdiction. Her loan files were filled with false statements about property rights and legal authority. A federal agent explained it clearly. When forged documents are used to secure financing from national banks, that falls under our jurisdiction. The penalties can go up to 30 years. Hearing that escalation to federal charges was exactly what I had hoped for. As Peterson's political allies abandoned her and her criminal risk escalated, I stood outside watching the evening news, realizing how effective proactive offense was compared to waiting defensively. Instead of merely responding to her schemes, I had methodically dismantled her influence, exposing her crimes through coordination with officials, the press, and neighborhood groups. The reporter's closing words were especially gratifying. Tomorrow, Peterson won't just be battling the property owner she tried to defraud. She'll be up against the entire community. The HOA meeting Peterson had scheduled a grand opening for her villa the following weekend, but I had already planned something else. An emergency HOA meeting that would become the centerpiece of my campaign to reveal her misconduct. Over 60 residents packed the community center that night. Unlike previous gatherings, I had prepared witnesses and documentation for maximum effect. This was not an ordinary neighborhood squabble. It was, in essence, a prosecution laid out under the guise of a community meeting. I opened by handing out HOA financial statements showing $47,000 in unauthorized spending. Every resident has the right to know where their dues go, I announced. Faces shifted as neighbors mentally calculated how much of their own money had been stolen. Some clutched the papers with trembling hands. Others whispered rapid figures to their spouses. And a few nodded grimly as Peterson's extravagant project suddenly made sense. A board member raised alarms about fiduciary responsibility. If we approve spending without authority, we could face personal lawsuits for negligent oversight. The discomfort on the board was obvious. Several threatened to resign unless Peterson immediately provided a full accounting and stopped all unauthorized activities. Peterson tried to regain control, but her voice lacked its usual command, and even her supporters exchanged uneasy glances. Testimonies against Peterson. Then came the testimonies. Mrs. Chen stood, visibly shaken. Peterson came to my house 3 times, pressuring me to sign statements saying Laura Grant was mentally unstable and a danger to the community. She even asked me to file false reports with county health services. When I refused, she threatened to raise my HOA fees. The room gasped. Mr. Rodriguez spoke next, admitting his regret. I believed her promises of higher property values and better amenities. I even donated extra money for her so-called wellness center. Now I see I was helping fund the theft of my neighbor's land. Councilman Torres, who had once been a vocal supporter of Peterson, now distanced himself. Community development requires proper legal procedures and resident approval, he said carefully, clearly aware of the political fallout of supporting criminal acts. His retreat signaled the collapse of Peterson's political shield. Frank then presented building code violations with professional precision, lending credibility to safety and compliance concerns. Right on cue, a building inspector entered the meeting and served official stop work orders for unpermitted construction. The timing wasn't accidental. I had coordinated with county officials to ensure regulatory action hit. During the meeting, this construction must stop immediately until ownership and permit issues are resolved, the inspector declared. Peterson snapped back, denying reality. This inspector has no jurisdiction over community projects. Wellness centers fall under different rules. Even her supporters recoiled at her denial. Several gasped openly at her defiance of lawful orders. Escalation to criminal proceedings. A representative from the district attorney's office was present, taking careful notes. His presence silenced the room each time he looked up from his pad. This gathering is not about neighborhood disputes, he finally said. We are documenting systemic financial fraud, embezzlement, and property theft. This is a criminal investigation now. The atmosphere shifted instantly. It no longer felt like a community meeting, but a courtroom proceeding. Local news crews arrived, cameras rolling as residents shared stories of fraud and abuse. Several announced plans to pursue civil lawsuits for stolen funds and damages from the illegal construction. Bank investigators also appeared at the site to examine collateral tied to Peterson's fraudulent loan applications. Because I had filed complaints with multiple institutions, simultaneous investigations unfolded. Local building authorities, the DA, federal agents, and civil attorneys all acting together. Coordinated action construction crews showed up the next morning despite stop work orders, prompting immediate confrontation with inspectors and law enforcement. Cameras captured every violation. Watching the coordinated enforcement, I realized just how much more powerful a united strategy was than piecemeal complaints. Peterson stood in the unfinished foundation of her villa, surrounded by cameras, her authority crumbling. Tonight she was still standing on that foundation, but tomorrow she could be standing in shackles, the grand opening and arrest despite everything. Peterson hosted her villa's grand opening with 30 guests, including HOA members, local officials, and real estate contacts who believed they were celebrating a legitimate project. Wearing a silk dress, she greeted visitors at the entrance, beaming with pride as she led them through what she called her community partnership achievement. The villa itself was stunning. Granite counters, hardwood floors, custom fixtures, nicer than anything I could have built myself. But it stood on my stolen land. I arrived with Laura, Frank, and 3 undercover officers gathering evidence. The HOA President noticed us but carried on with her tour, forcing a smile as if possession and public support could erase her crimes. I cut through the charade. "Thank you, Peterson, for building such a beautiful house on my property," I announced, producing my deed, inheritance papers, and county records for all to see. The crowd froze. Laura stepped forward with legal documents in hand. "These actions constitute multiple felonies: criminal trespass, embezzlement, forgery, and bank fraud," she stated firmly. Frank followed with his expert assessment of code violations. Several guests quietly slipped toward the exits. Then, from the crowd, the district attorney emerged. Deputies moved into position as she read the charges. "Mrs. Peterson, you are under arrest for embezzlement, fraud, trespassing, and conspiracy to commit bank fraud." Cameras rolled as officers cuffed Peterson in her marble foyer. The silk of her dress crumpled as the metal clicked shut. Guests instinctively stepped back, murmurs of disbelief rippling through the villa. Peterson's polished hostess mask collapsed into panicked protests and demands for her lawyer. Federal agents soon followed, serving additional warrants. "Federal bank fraud carries up to 30 years in prison," the lead agent announced to the room. Guests scattered as the scope of charges sank in. Aftermath as the chaos unfolded, I walked through the villa, rooms filled with luxury features funded by theft. The master suite's closet dwarfed my parents' old house. The gourmet kitchen gleamed with high-end appliances. Even a climate-controlled wine cellar waited downstairs. Ironically, Peterson had built my dream home while destroying her own future, but county officials condemned the property immediately. "This structure violates every safety requirement and poses a public hazard," the director declared. The house could never be occupied without complete reconstruction. Peterson's assets were frozen as restitution and damages were calculated. Laura gathered neighbor testimonies about how Peterson had pressured them into filing false reports or spreading lies about our family. As Peterson was led to the patrol car, she made one last defiant statement to the cameras. "This land needed development for the good of the community, but the neighbors weren't buying it anymore." Some who had once supported her approached me with apologies. "We didn't know she was building on stolen land," one longtime resident admitted, shaking his head.